Monsieur le conseiller administratif, vos excellences, mesdames et messieurs, en vos titres et fonctions, chers collègues, chères étudiantes, chers étudiants, chers amis, bonne soirée et bienvenue à la Maison de la Paix. I'm really delighted to welcome you tonight for the launch of the third edition of the Geneva Policy Outlook, GPO 2025. The Geneva Policy Outlook is an initiative with three main objectives: generate critical debate and systemic perspective by nurturing and animating a diverse community. Second, connect science and academic debates with the concrete and multiple challenges of our radically uncertain and increasingly dangerous world. Third, produce actionable and forward-looking insights that can inform the types of courageous decision-making that our world and its challenges badly need. We launched this initiative exactly 3 years ago. As a matter of fact, exactly when Russia's all-out invasion of Ukraine, and let's call a cat, left all of us in shock. This initiative, I should add, contributes to the materialization of our vision and our mission at the Institute. As a pioneer in the exploration of global issues, the Institute opens creative spaces for diverse communities and fosters the understanding and the engagement that are essential to a peaceful, equitable, and sustainable world. But the Geneva Policy Outlook is also much more than that. It has been from the start a fruitful collaborative project, so let me express tonight a number of heartfelt thanks. Thanks to our co-founding partners, first and foremost, the Republic and State of Geneva, the City of Geneva, and the Fondation pour Genève have believed in the project from the start, and they have invested with us to make this a reality. Let me also express our deep appreciation to the community that has crystallized around the Geneva Policy Outlook and its three-dimensional objective. I would like to thank all of you. I see many of you here in this room tonight. I'm impressed by the quality, the depth, and the breadth of our discussions and of the contributions that we produce year after year. The Geneva Policy Outlook is having an impact on us as a collective, but importantly, it is also increasingly impacting broader circles of policymakers and actors in Geneva and in Switzerland. We do get this feedback regularly, and this is really very positive. I've learned a lot personally, and I feel that we have been able to go quite far in building up what is needed today, a community of learning that is able to produce new insights, propositions, and steps towards solutions by bringing together diverse and complementary expertise. Within that broad community of learning, let me give particular thanks to the contributors for this year's edition. The next collective challenge we should set for ourselves is to extend our reach and carry our voice at the international level, and I hope we do that in the coming year. Internally, at the Institute, let me also express my most sincere thanks to Hakim Venman, the soul of this project, as well as to Lena Menge, Emilian Beruti, Gabriel Gomos-Couto, and Pratit Singh for all the energy and work that they have put into this project this year. Let me add here my thanks to the excellent support at different stages of the project, including from Abba Kalindi, Cécile de Gardel, Tiffany Laborie-Bousquet, and Oleg Smerdov. The 2025 edition's title is Charting the Path to Multilateralism 2.0. A lot has happened since we came up with this title in the fall. In a certain sense, it seems like a lifetime ago. I even feel that as we are here together tonight, we might be missing the latest outrage that could render obsolete some of our discussions. The chaos created by the new Trump administration has gone off the charts, taking us into unknown territory and a radical uncertainty that is even more radical than what I had in mind over the last years when I was using that term. This chaos is all by design, naturally, and it makes even more clear to us what a world without a multilateral architecture would be bound to look like. And this is neither a world we would want to live in, nor a world that would serve the interests of the very vast majority of humanity. So the title and the focus of the 2025 edition is spot on, and it remains so. The crisis of multilateralism we are experiencing is made acute by the dynamics at work in Washington, but we have to acknowledge that it has been in the making for some time. Pax Americana and its Atlanticist projection, an era of relative stability and order since 1945, has essentially ended. Perhaps that is all for the better because the multilateral architecture that came with it was showing major cracks for already some time. First, it had never managed to adapt to the profound transformation of the geopolitical balance of power. Second, it was not fit to deal with the kinds of existential common challenges that we are having to face. Think only of climate change or technology. Third, multilateralism as we know it has been significantly delegitimized through what became over the last decades an increasingly visible pattern of double standards. Finally, the cracks also came from within. The multilateral architecture associated with the American century has repeatedly shown that it is wanting when it comes to efficiency and effectiveness. What is more shocking and less expected, though, is that some of the most violent and maybe the final blows would come not from a resentful periphery, but from the historical champion and carrier of our current multilateral architecture, the United States of America, that still actually is a strongly benefits from that architecture. The question of the why and the how is an interesting one in itself, but tonight I want to focus on the where to now. What is to be done? Thomas Friedman, a journalist and essayist, recently said about Donald Trump, "I cannot believe he's a Russian agent, but he sure plays one on TV." The new Trump-Putin alignment is essentially asking us to accept a world where the rule of law and the law of rules that are inscribed in the idea of multilateralism would be replaced by the rule of force. This is an alternative that we cannot accept because it's the surest path to an all-out war. And an all-out war in current circumstances could imply the type of existential disaster that all nation-states in their right mind would want to avoid. The good news is that a large majority of United Nations member states still believe that the existence of a world order defined by rule of law and the law of rules is the only solution. Our common interest across the world, and in spite of our many differences, has two key existential dimensions. One, prevent the return of war. And two, ensure the preservation of our planet and natural resources so that the next generations can live a life of dignity. So yes, Europe needs to disconnect its defense system from the American one and rethink its links with NATO. But it should not only be rearming itself. To the chaos by design that rules in Washington, Europe should oppose political imagination. Let us see the moment as a clear call for collective action. There is a need to construct a broad coalition that would go well beyond Europe and should cross many boundaries. Seen from an Atlanticist mindset, this coalition could be surprising, if not unthinkable. The project for this coalition, building on its common interest that I outlined before, would be to urgently work on a new multilateral project for peace and sustainability, a profoundly transformed multilateral architecture fit for purpose and ready to face the challenges of our times. Let's call it for now a global coalition for sustainable peace. This is where Geneva has a unique and important role to play. The long tradition and experience, the unique soil and irrigation that characterizes the place, the spirit of Geneva, and the physical collocation still of many actors representing a large share of the multilateral system and almost all nations of the world create both an opportunity and a responsibility for Geneva to contribute actively to the design of a reinvented multilateralism. This mobilization of Geneva needs to happen fast. It requires a profound mental revolution away from the Atlanticist mindset, and it calls for radical political imagination and innovation, which implies intellectual and political courage. Geneva and International Geneva should be bold enough to seize this agenda and to make it theirs. And at the Institute, we believe that the Geneva Policy Outlook and the Institute can be important mechanisms to steer some of the collective work that needs to materialize to go in that direction. Arguably, as you will judge from the discussion that will follow, some of this work is already starting and has already started in the discussions that led to GPO 2025. In his memoirs, Jean Monnet affirmed that in exceptional moments, I quote, anything is possible provided that we are prepared, that we are ready, and that we have a clear plan at the moment when everything appears uncertain. As we are indeed in an exceptional period, we must prepare ourselves and develop a clear plan in the form of a courageous vision for united action and a concrete agenda for materializing this vision. In one form or another, the Geneva Policy Outlook can and should be, as I said before, an important mechanism allowing us to go in that direction, carrying the voice of Geneva for the world and with the world, a voice that should be reaffirmed and should reaffirm its own tone or spirit in the process. This needs to happen in spite of, if not because of, the current violent and dissonant chorus. This is my dream, this year as the two previous ones, but this year in maybe a much more urgent way. Let me wish all of you a very nice evening, enjoy the discussions, and I'm now leaving the floor to Sami Kanan, Vice President, Executive Council of the City of Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Laure Salle, for hosting us at the Graduate Institute. Always a pleasure to be here. Ladies and gentlemen, I won't tell all your qualities and functions because they are various, diverse. You have all in common an interest for the multilateral Geneva, being diplomats, academics, students, NGOs, or other kinds of roles. And thank you for being here. You won't be surprised also that I'm quite aligned with Marie-Laure Salle. I could try to find differences, diverging point of view, it will be difficult. Which is maybe not a good sign, we need diverging point of views. Still, I'm happy to take the floor today in the name of the authorities of the City of Geneva, and I can say that most probably I'm completely aligned also with the Canton of Geneva, since in this respect, and especially towards the Geneva Policy Outlook initiative, and the more wider issues of multilateral Geneva, we are with the Canton of Geneva very closely cooperating and working together. The mood tonight is obviously not very reassuring. Marie-Laure told it. We are aware, maybe not enough yet, of the grim realities of our time. It's a very special period of time. I mean, the world has always been complicated. You have bad news when you wake up in the morning, but the rhythm of news is difficult. I mean, you get to bed with a headline coming from Washington, the latest mind-blowing announcement from the Trump administration, you not even manage to understand it, you go to bed, you sleep bad, and you wake up in the morning, you have already the two next announcements. And one of them this morning concerns directly the department I'm in charge of in the City of Geneva, because I'm also in charge of digital and also cybersecurity. You have seen that the Secretary of Defense, Mr. Hexet, announced that they stop the cyber defense against Russian threats. Maybe it's a critique to Europe. We were too much counting on the US umbrella. And it's much worse in this field, cybersecurity, than in the classical military sense, because except with the dramatic example of Ukraine, we haven't had recently Russian military attacks on our soil, but cyber attacks all the time. So this decision has directly impact on our lives. So it's not just a matter of global, analysis. And it's one of many, I won't count them. And also for Geneva, obviously, trying to discuss the future of multilateralism seems almost a bit like discussing in a house about a big concept while the flood is outside, or earthquake, or a big fire, since the situation is really very difficult. It's almost a daunting task, because some people just say, come on, forget it, it's over, game over. You may know that one of the most influential persons in the Trump administration, more influential than Elon Musk, is Peter Thiel, the head of Palantir. And he said, in a way, I'm simplifying, but it's that democracy is over. It's over. It's not compatible anymore with personal freedom. So it's not just, abstract. It's not just like talking in a cafe about special ideas. It's happening. So for us in Geneva, on the one hand, we have the direct impact of decisions because of the budget cuts, and also the political aspect of all of it. So multilateralism was probably never, since at least Second World War II, so massive strain. But it's not only the US. I mean, it's not that the Russian or Turkish or Chinese or some Middle East countries were very good pupils of multilateralism. But still, it's like a contamination, because the more governments assume to just violate fundamental issues, fundamental rights, rules like human rights, humanitarian rights, the more governments will dare to do it, other ones. So we have direct impact. The first immediate impact is employment. A lot of people are banging on their jobs. But all kinds of other threats, the diversity also of the ecosystem, the in-depth of the analysis, all this. So it's very tangible. And some field programs are forced to cease operation from one moment to other. Your counterparts you were calling before or emailing disappeared. But it's also a global context, because even if it's far less, far smaller sums, even I have to say that the Swiss federal authorities are not really in the good trend, because despite the fact that our federal financial situation it was one of the most healthy in the world, they're making heavy cuts, also affecting international Geneva. So the initiative of the Geneva Policy Outlook is essential. I mean, we won't be able to compensate immediately this loss, but we can try to think about tools to rethink and sustain the multilateral system. We need it, not just for Geneva, we need it for our planet. It's a not very original statement, but when you face challenges which are so huge, you cannot escape, you definitely need to transform them, to transform the crisis in an opportunity. How will it look like in the years ahead? How can we still demonstrate not only to specialists? One of our main challenges is also to demonstrate it to wider parts of the population that multilateralism is still totally relevant to ensure that brute force, blackmail diplomacy, toxic masculinism, and depraved capitalism are not now the new rules of international relations. How can we safeguard peace, democracy, human rights, which theoretically are a common framework, but we have some doubts if some countries still believe in it, at least still some governance. I may be naive, but considering the fact that to some extent we have to forget about the whole US, partnership for some time, I would hope that Europe takes the opportunity to wake up. Seemingly they do it, but for the moment I see it only, which is already something, about Ukraine and the military defense, but no world can build up only on defense, military defense. Maybe cybersecurity also, they will take over. I would definitely hope that Europe really makes the effort to go to other places in the world, to Latin America, to Africa, to Asia. We need new alliances where we don't need the US, or the Russians, by the way. And we have to offer opportunities, open ones, not colonialistic, to these regions. I would hope that Switzerland would do that. For the moment, I don't see anything, but let's hope. These are a lot of pressing questions that we can really think over, and Geneva Policy Outlook already tackled it in very interesting articles in the last months and years. So rest assured that the City of Geneva, modestly, we are a city, will do everything in its power to keep international Geneva at the forefront. And we will play our part in promoting a diverse and inclusive multilateralism, which also includes the local and regional governments. I'm deeply convinced that one of the strands we have to follow are local and regional governments, because again, you look in the US, where is the main resistance to the Trump administration? In the cities. So I wish you a very interesting discussion. Unfortunately, I cannot stay for the panel, but I'm really thankful for all the people who take their time, energy, ideas, And to finish, I would like to quote a writer called Maya Angelou, translating more or less from the French. Be as creative as possible, because creativity is something interesting. The more you use it, the more you have creativity. It's endless. So let's be creative. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Allow me to add a few words also to frame the panel that we're about to start. And also thank you very much, Marie-Laure and Sami, for your opening reflections. I think they really rightly emphasize the exceptional moment we live in today and the urgency that we have in front of us to reinvent diplomacy and international cooperation. Now, I lived in Geneva for 25 years now. And particularly, I lived and worked in international Geneva. Many of you here might be in Geneva longer. Some of you a little shorter, 5, 10, 15 years. But for the great majority of us, this is the first experience of a very deep crisis of this global hub. Since the year 2000, when I came to study at the Institute, international Geneva has only expanded and diversified. Budget of large footprint international organizations grew from 4.2 billion in 2002 to 23.6 billion in 2020. Huge expansion. International Geneva diversified its diplomatic spaces beyond the UN, international organizations and permanent missions to platforms of multi-stakeholder engagement and action. Formal diplomacy between states has been complemented by private diplomacy run through networks. Geneva also works now on many, many more issues than 25 years ago. What I like to say, Geneva works at least on 24 issues 24/7 every day of the week. Plus, every week of the year. Plus, there is a private sector international in Geneva that has a huge global footprint, and that is not necessarily part of the imaginary of that international public Geneva. Now, this is where I take my source of optimism, because given this diversity, international Geneva is unlikely to disappear. It is unlikely to experience again a 1930s moment. But what is likely is serious downsizing. That's a real prospect, I think. And we've heard the arguments and the comments from Sami Canon. Now, I think the next 5 months are particularly important, because this is the moment that the Trump administration will review its international commitments as announced in an executive order of the 3rd of February. That's 13,000 international legal commitments of the United States of America and commitment in over 100 international organizations. Now, from what I see in the media, I think this is not going to be a very deep and research-based, evidence-based approach. So it's going to be something very rough. But there are 5 months to prepare for this review. Some organizations in international Geneva, health, humanitarian, and human rights sectors are already affected, given their significant exposure to US funding. And how this executive order in the next couple of months will be implemented will be very important for Geneva. So this is a space to watch for every one of us, I think. There's a Mexican saying that goes, "Camarón que se duerme, se lo lleva la corriente," which translates as the shrimp that falls asleep is carried away by the current. Geneva cannot sleep right now, or just do business as usual. Geneva needs all hands on deck to reinvent its role in a new world order, and for diplomacy and international cooperation to remain a primary instrument for global politics. As Marie-Laure said, to seize the moment requires anticipation, preparation, and a clear plan. And it means to go beyond complacency, to shape and accelerate the adaptation of international Geneva as a global hub. That is the moment to do it. We have it right in front of us. The moment will not come back. Now, this is exactly the purpose for which the Geneva Policy Outlook was piloted in 2022. Then we witnessed the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today, we are seeing the end of the North Atlantic Alliance, end of Pax Americana, as Marie-Laure said, a Europe in the middle of an unfriendly squeeze between the US and Russia. But we also see something else. We also see that a majority of states and people are interested in multilateralism and a rules-based order, because most of the world is small and doesn't have power. And this is where we go to the heart of multilateralism as a defense system for small countries and people without power. It's been designed to rein in power. So obviously, those who don't have power, they have an interest in collective multilateralism and the collective security that it represents. Now, I take a lot of optimism from the exchanges we have day in, day out with the community of the Geneva Policy Outlook. And I come away with, in fact, the optimism that we can reinvent international cooperation and diplomacy from Geneva, connected to the world as one of multiple global hubs. I'm optimistic for Geneva's role because the topics worked on here will remain important for a great many countries and people, be they related to climate impact, pandemics, demography, human mobility, urbanization, trade, new and old big and small weapons, and of course new technology from AI to quantum, and many other topics. But I'm most optimistic because I see an incredible human competence, skills, and expertise that is collected in this city. In particular, I want to say collected in this room. Ultimately, this human asset of know-how and knowledge will be critical to preserve. This is why job losses are so dangerous, because once you lose your job, Swiss migration law doesn't make it easy for you to stay in Geneva for a long time. Now, particularly for those outside of the EU. Now, that is capital lost. So keeping that ultimate resource is something really important. And tonight, we are blessed to have an outstanding lineup of exceptional professionals that have contributed to the Geneva Policy Outlook. And with this, I would like to invite our panelists on the stage. My colleague Jussi Hannemäki, who is a professor of international history and politics at the Graduate Institute here. Heba Ali, who is the coordinator of the UN Charter Reform Coalition and senior advisor at the Coalition for the UN We Need, and the former CEO of the New Humanitarian. Welcome, Heba. And last minute addition, very thankful you can be here, Margot A. Bagley, who is the Asa Griggs Candler Professor of Law at Emory University School of Law in Atlanta. I'd also like to welcome my colleague Gianluca Burci, a senior visiting professor of international law and academic advisor at the Global Health Center at the Institute here, and Jean-Marc Ricli, head of global and emerging risks at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, just in the Maison de la Paix here. And last but surely not least, Pratit Singh, my colleague working with the Geneva Policy Outlook and who is also a student at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Please allow the panelists a roaring applause, and let's get started. Now, and I think I'm just going to moderate standing from here. This is great. So look, so you know, when I lecture, I always tell everyone to put the mobiles away. But today, I think you should put them out and look for the GenevaPolicyOutlook.ch. We also want to get some more hits on our statistics. So.
But also, Akim, things are changing by the minute. So actually, we need the updates on the phone as we go.
Okay, well, okay, good. So we'll come to this. But look, what we're going to do in the panel, we're going to unpack a little bit the contributions of the Geneva Policy Outlook by the three sections which you have in front of you, on the notion of a multilateral 2.0, on diplomacy in action, and new issues for our radar that we should have very clear in front of us. So you see, you are a professor of history, You are also a grand expert on the history of the United States of America. What a surprise, you wrote a book on Kissinger, among many other books. Help us to situate the moment that we are currently living and what Trump too might do to Geneva or is already doing to Geneva. Jussi, please.
So thank you. First of all, thank you for wonderful opening statements and speeches. Thank you for my fellow panelists for being here. Thank you, Achim, for making it all possible. And thank you all of you for being here. I mean, this is the problem with the meeting is that I think, broadly speaking, we probably all agree on a number of things here. That's why we are in this room, and that's, of course, it's a statement about today's media climate overall. That you preach to the converted most of the time, and so that is there is a problem with that. So let me, before I say a few words about Trump, if that is necessary, and we all have heard plenty about him. On Sunday, I was following, as most of you, the Europeans in London. Finnish President Alex Stubb came over for the meeting, and journalists asked him, so what's going on? And so his point, oh, come on, calm down. It's just a Finnish attitude to things. Take a deep breath, take a sauna. It's all gonna be fine. 2 days later, it seems he has become a little less calm, talking about there's a fog over the Atlantic and so forth. And I think that's the sort of thing that one of the issues about the last 6 weeks or so is that, as another Finnish commentator, there's a bullet train going, and we just can't get on it because it's moving so fast. And so part about Trump is that this is, I wrote in another piece, this is an old man in a very big hurry to get as much done in as short a period of time as is possible. And his instinct is that he has to be on the news every day, virtually non-stop. And of course, it's very disruptive. It's very, destabilizing mentally for many of us. You go to sleep and you wake up and say, what on earth happened last night? Because of the time difference, what's the latest? And today it was, as you all know, a series of announcements about cyber security, about trade war with Canada and China and Mexico, and no more military aid for Ukraine. So, it was a nice threesome as it was. Now, the thing about Trump is that, yes, he is a bit of a wrecking ball when it comes down to any number of issues, including, of course, transatlantic relations, including potentially, yes, international Geneva and the multilateral order. We've seen him already double down on the certain things from his first administration regarding the WHO, regarding the Paris climate agreements, etc. So there is ultimately, in a sense, nobody should be really, really surprised about this. What we see is, in a sense, to me at least, seems this is American multilateralism has always been a kind of an a la carte approach. It suits us, it helps us, fine. If not, we're out. I mean, that's the attitude. And we can do that because, after all, who's paying the bill? And I think that is really, when we talk about Trump 2.0, which is very much going to be this disruptive period, we have to understand it's part and parcel. In a sense, it fits into a longer tradition of American sort of ambivalence about multilateralism that has much longer roots than Trump. It's not just Trump. There is a clear sort of tendency within the United States to treat the rest of the world as a kind of an alien species and so forth. But then, of course, there is the other trend, which is very much the sort of globalist outlook. One thing we need to remember about last year's elections is that Trump did not get 50% of the vote. he got 49.7. So that's an important point to keep in mind. He did not get the majority of the votes of those who did vote for the president in November. Now, the outcome is what it is. He's the president, there is the control by the Republicans, and we're seeing now what we used to call the honeymoon of an American president, the 100 days. They can pretty much do whatever they want for 100 days, and give or take. And that, of course, in Trump's case, is extremely disturbing for many of us. He's gone after almost anything, and whether it's within the United States or externally. Now, coming to multilateralism, and so multilateralism 2.0, which is, I guess, the point of tonight's discussion. The real lesson I take from this is that the multilateralism we have had for the past 80 years or so has had a very deep problem built into it. It's been a multilateralism that depends on the whims of one country to a large extent, because of the funding and the outsized impact that the United States has had over the whole system of multilateral organizations. And that clearly is a kind of an oxymoronic thing. If you call this multilateralism, but really it's backed by unilateral funding regime. Not quite unilateral, of course, but in a sense there's a dominant player within that can, in a sense, call the rules and so forth. And when I, in my article, talk about the need for a more inclusive, more multilateralism, in effect, that's ultimately what I mean, is that one has to conceive of tools, of methods, whether in terms of funding and in other ways, in which the future of multilateralism cannot depend on a few thousand voters in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and any of these so-called swing states in the United States, that this would be extremely problematic, and then we cannot really call it anymore sort of multilateralism in that case. Maybe I'll stop there. I think that is sufficiently aggressive.
No, this is exactly, I think, the mood, because I keep that sentence in your article very present, that a multilateral system that depends on one country, how much legitimacy does it still have? So that's, I think, a very important fundamental reflection that we need to put at the start if we want to develop a new type of system. Or, in fact, if we want to rewrite the foundational documents of what the United Nations is about. And Heba, that's kind of, your initiative is about that, right? More or less, if I paraphrase it correctly.
Yeah, I'm laughing because of the expression on your face, which is usually the expression I get when I tell people I'm working to rewrite the UN Charter. But I think that, if we want multilateralism to be more multilateral, it has to serve the majority, and right now it doesn't. And so I think step one is, how do we make this system actually work for the global majority? I also appreciated the frankness at the beginning of Marie-Laure and Sami, and agreed with most of it, but I disagreed with Sami that we're sitting in a house talking about abstract issues while there's a fire outside. Actually, we're talking about how to put out the fire. And so this is, to my mind, the most urgent conversation we can be having. And I also disagree with Jussi, since Sami wanted disagreement. I don't think we're preaching to the converted here. I think we're strategizing, and we need that desperately right now. So if the rules of the game are broken, then the place to go is to the very kind of founding document of our international relations, the UN Charter. Now, you might argue the rules aren't broken, it's the fact that the rules aren't being respected. But I think the part of the reason the rules aren't being respected is because of the inadequacy of this instrument, and the increasingly clear irrelevance of the UN. So, to my mind, if we want to come back to a system that is actually going to serve small states and save small states and protect us from the rule of force, we need a system that people believe in, that is credible, that is legitimate. Otherwise, what we're seeing now is just the beginning. So, our initiative, the UN Charter Reform Coalition, is trying to mobilize member states to update, rewrite, reimagine, use whatever word you want, the UN Charter, which was, as we all know, drafted at a very different time in 1945 with a very different mindset and a different world. And so we feel it is no longer the right conceptual framework for the world we live in today on a number of fronts. It has an outdated conception of the threats we face. We've heard that already. The Charter doesn't mention the word environment. Obviously, AI wasn't at all an issue then. It has an outdated distribution of power, where 5 countries who won a war 80 years ago are manipulating the system for their own interests, and where most of Africa was colonized at the time of the UN Charter's drafting, and the South continues 80 years later to have very little voice. And so I would argue, to your earlier point about multilateralism serving small states, it's not right now. And then finally, its overall conceptual framing is wrong, because it is an instrument that is focused on the nation state and national sovereignty, and we now live in a very interdependent world. And I think the last 2 weeks obviously have put on display how inadequate it is. So the good news is the drafters of the UN Charter were wise enough to include an Article 109, that calls for a review mechanism and a review conference to be possible with a majority of states voting in favor of it. It was, in fact, a promise, essentially, to all of the countries that were opposed to the Security Council veto power to say, this is a particular moment in time, post-World War II. Just go with this for now, and we'll revisit this within 10 years. We'll have this review conference, we'll redistribute power, we'll get rid of the veto. And of course, we're now celebrating the 80th anniversary of the UN, and this hasn't happened. But this was a built-in mechanism from the very beginning. The Charter was meant to be a living document. And in fact, when then US President Harry Truman adopted the Charter, he said this is a living document. It should evolve as world conditions change. And I think we'd be crazy not to argue that world conditions have changed, and this is the moment. So we are now establishing a new secretariat here in Geneva as a starting point for a new global campaign that is modeled on other successful campaigns, like the International Campaign for the International Criminal Court, to the campaign to ban landmines, and to use 3 kind of tools to mobilize member states in this effort, with the goal of calling this review conference and having a global conversation about the multilateralism we need today. So we're working on the member state level, we're working on building a kind of civil society movement and setting the policy agenda. We are now at a point where it is reform or die for the UN, and so we don't have time for incrementalism, and we need big radical moves. And although many governments, their initial reaction is, oh my goodness, this is terrifying, not the right time to reopen the Charter, don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so we have to deal with a lot of the fears around doing this, but I think we all would agree that actually the current trajectory is even more risky.
But I think what you and your initiative illustrate is the type of courage that Marie-Laure spoke of, that if we don't have these big ideas and the initiatives, we won't necessarily face the challenge. Because, as you rightly say, we need to put important documents on the table and adapt them.
Yeah,
and find the alliances that are willing to walk in that direction. And that's a different type of work.
And very different kinds of alliances that are going to change based on the issue, but we need to find them, I think. But also just to recognize the current system is collapsing. And so whether we like it or not, we are going to reach a tipping point. And when it comes, we should be ready with a plan and a vision for the future. Otherwise, we get caught flat-footed. And who shapes the future? The people who have a much more dangerous idea of what multilateralism should be.
So this was one of the very practical ideas that we featured in the Geneva Policy Outlook this year. There were a couple of other articles which we highlighted, which one was by Hugo Slim, who really put up a very, very straightforward proposition to, in fact, adapt the humanitarian system to include the climate change adaptation lens in it, not looking at people in need, but places in need. And if you think it through what this would mean for the humanitarian sector, it's a pretty significant step in a different direction. We also have Solomon Derso, who heads Amani Africa in Addis Ababa, who wrote about the importance of building up network multilateralism and think about the dynamics and mechanisms that it is really that one can construct in order to make that work beyond the pure narrative. And then there's, of course, Marie-Laure's article on a new agenda for sustainability. Very practical suggestions that are presented with courage, and that I do invite you to read. You can take your phone and explore them. Now, we are, of course, with the Geneva Policy Outlook, want to have a finger on the pulse what's happening. in Geneva, in the negotiations, in this diplomatic kitchen, in this hotspot of diplomatic negotiations and compromise. And yes, there has been good news. Because we have a new WIPO treaty on intellectual property, genetic resources, and associated traditional knowledge. Now, can I just ask how many people knew this before reading the Geneva Policy Outlook? Huh? Okay. So, I would say a clear minority. But it is multilateralism at its best. And no one better than Margot, who's been so deeply involved in shepherding this treaty to reality, to give us a hint of how does it work in the current day and age for a successful completion of an international treaty.
Thank you. So it's interesting, and I've really appreciated hearing all of the perspectives presented so far. And there were places before Trump 2.0 where multilateralism was not working. And WIPO, certain WIPO committees, that was one of the places. And the IGC, the Intergovernmental Committee on Intellectual Property and Genetic Resources, Traditional Knowledge and Folklore, was one of those places where member states had been talking for 25 years and not really making meaningful progress. And so I just want to highlight a couple of things that made that treaty possible and that I think do have the ability to give us broader lessons for this period in which we find ourselves. And one is to have hope and to not give up the belief that things can get better and that they can get better in the most unusual and unexpected of circumstances. And so the importance of strategic opportunism and being prepared to take advantage of situations that arise, because that's really what happened. We had, so WIPO, at least in the IGC, it operates, two key things I'll talk about are process, and strategic opportunism in relation to process and how process really matters, and then geopolitical dynamics. But the WIPO committees operate on the basis of consensus. And so one country can block things from moving forward, and that happened quite a bit in the IGC. The IGC was about very much low and middle income countries' concerns, about the genetic resources, traditional knowledge, indigenous peoples and local communities. And these were things that some other countries were not very concerned about, and industries within those countries did not want a treaty that would put a light on the patent system in terms of the ways that these resources were being used. And so another thing about the committee is that every country had the right to have their positions represented in the negotiating text. And so that allowed countries to litter the text with brackets, hundreds of brackets, and alternatives. And it was a mess. It was a mess. And 1 year you would have one country blocking, and a couple years later you'd have another country blocking when it seemed like there was progress. Though quite honestly, there were really just 4 or 5 countries that really, really didn't want anything to happen, and the United States was one of them. And the United States blocked in 2018, and that block, and that actually the fact that things seemed so disorganized and that no progress was being made was actually an opportunity for the chair, Ian Goss of Australia, to say, you know what? I'm going to write my own text, a chair's text that no one else can put anything in, and that actually looked like a treaty. Now, he tabled that in 2019. After that, we had the pandemic. It still didn't look like anything was going to happen. Things happened very strangely for him to be removed as chair, but that's a whole nother story as to what might have been or who might have been behind that. But then, at the WIPO General Assemblies, something interesting happened. And the war in Ukraine, so the geopolitics, is the reason why we have this new treaty. In fact, why we have 2 new WIPO treaties in 1 year in 2024. The WIPO IGC Treaty, GRATK Treaty, and the Riyadh Design Law Treaty. And that was because there was a proposal to provide technical assistance to the IP Office of Ukraine, and that was not surprisingly vigorously opposed by Russia. And for an organization that does not vote, there was a proposal to vote. Let's vote on it. And there were several votes taken on this technical assistance provision. And there were some enterprising, very savvy diplomats from several African countries who said, now that we're voting on one thing, maybe we can vote on some other things. And got together with diplomats from some of the high-income countries who wanted the design law treaty and said, if we get together as a group, we'll have enough votes that we can actually move this forward. And so it was a horse trade, essentially. You get your treaty, we'll get our treaty, we'll be able to really marginalize and cabin the folks who don't want this. And it worked. It was brilliant. And interestingly enough, it was something that the United States didn't see coming, because otherwise they would not have agreed to all this voting to begin with. And seeing the writing on the wall, they said, okay, let's stop all this voting. We won't block. We can have an agreement by consensus. But it was important that there was a chair's text that looked like a treaty, so being prepared for opportunities that may arise, and having leverage. Okay, the fact that there were these two agreements, there's a whole other story behind the design law treaty, but being able to take advantage of the changes in the process that created the opportunity for voting and for more of a majority, the fact that, and to realize that you might have friends in places you didn't initially think that you had, or at least you have common goals that you can both benefit from. So with that, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Margot, to walk us through this and to remind us the patience needed, because this process, the chair's text was tabled in 2019. Yes. The negotiations go way back. Yes. So that is also the slow working of multilateralism, but the strategic opportunism, and where moments of change offer this opportunity. So that's, I think, in particular in the current moment, something to take away from. No? Now, this was a successful negotiation in Geneva. There's, of course, another very, very, very big, important negotiation happening in Geneva as well. That's the Pandemics Treaty. No? And Gianluca, you've been following the Pandemics Treaty with Suri Moon, who wrote, of course, for the Geneva Policy Outlook, together for many, many years. Can you give us a heads up? Where we stand? Is there an opportunity for this strategic opportunism that you just heard about? And is this something in a sector that is so much under pressure right now in Geneva? Is there a magic opportunity to get out of this moment and have a treaty, in fact? Big questions.
Big question indeed. So, unfortunately, in the sort of global health ecosystem in Geneva, it's a bit of a doom and gloom moment. But there are some bright also moments, and I think there is some silver lining, inevitably. So the pandemic agreement, as you may know, has been negotiated for 3 years. And it was a clear reaction to COVID. We need to come together, fill the gap where we can set at least the minimum rules to cooperate to avoid another disaster. And we missed an opportunity last year. There will be another opportunity May this year, but frankly, it's finger-crossed material. The outcome is very uncertain. And there is only 5 days of formal negotiations, and we can spend hours in recounting, I think, the mistakes that have plagued the whole process, from the conception of this to how the process unfolded. But if you take a step back and going back to the theme a bit of the policy outlook, you see some fairly fundamental issues. One is the great mistrust by developing countries versus developed countries. I think COVID was such a scanning experience that just there's no trust. And second is the interesting but worrying dichotomy between security, so adopting the measure that can, again, prevent another pandemic, and equity. So we need to, COVID was a tragedy of equity. And we had 15 million deaths because there was no equity, no solidarity. As if they were mutually exclusive, instead of the two sides of the same coin. And here we are stuck. And So many things can happen. The feeling is that if member states miss the 2025 deadline, the treaty will go on by inertia, because it's very unpopular to pull the plug and say, okay, we failed and let's finish. But it will lose a lot of momentum. And also the attitude of the United States is a big variable. So let's hope that there is a silver lining also on this account, because that will allow states also to stop agonizing on commas and words, but to move to implementation, to move to planning, to move to think how to bring this into reality. The good news is that the other piece of international legislation that we have in the shelves, the international health regulations, had been amended, successfully amended in 2024. It's been a very conservative outcome compared with the ambition of the initial proposal. So some observers are disappointed. We would have liked to see more equity into the instrument and so on. I personally think it was the best possible outcome under the circumstances. It has strengthened an instrument which, after all, is the only piece of law we have on the shelf right now, and has validated also the approach of the regulation, which is more technical, more operational, less political. Of course, everything is political, but not so much as the agreement. So both instruments put a lot of demands on WHO, financial demands, operational demands, political demands. And that comes at a time where the leitmotif of tonight, we have a big systemic shock of the United States, both in the pending withdrawal that should take place next year, but also in the sudden overnight cutting of financial and operational ties overnight. And so there is a lot of dust in the air, and I think that some of the dust will have to settle, because Marie-Laure spoke of chaos by design. Absolutely, it's chaos by design, but you cannot have 4 years of chaos by design. At some point, I think there will have to be a sense of direction of where the Trump administration is going. But for the moment, and not only in WHO, in most international actors in Geneva, there is a lot of confusion, because there have been suspension, termination, waivers, core challenges in the US. It's impossible to plan. So organizations have taken precautionary measures. WHO has frozen more or less everything, but difficult to plan beyond that. And ironically, this is a budget year for WHO. This was discussed in January in the executive board, but are very difficult decisions about the level of the budget, about who pays for what, about basically spreading what is lost from the United States. But I don't see this rush to fill the gap, frankly, because obviously there is, as you said, multilateralism is still alive. And so WHO is very important to many countries, but at the same time, they don't want necessarily to be seen as automatically picking up what the United States has dropped. So it's a moment of uncertainty. And also this affects, as you know very well, a lot of international Geneva. There was an article in the New York Times which was absolutely heartbreaking. So even small NGOs, small programs in the field, these are human lives. So there was really like a catalog of the forecast in increasing in mortality, malnutrition, child mortality, for projects that are worth some tens of thousands of dollars. So it's a bit difficult to understand. The other thing that's a bit difficult to understand is that this cutting of the ties is not just financial, but it's also in the scientific operation. For example, the US Center for Disease Control, which is one of the most sophisticated collaborating centers of WHO, has stopped sharing the strains of influenza that must go in the vaccine. Before coming here, I opened the website of WHO, and WHO just announced the cocktail of viruses that will go in next year's vaccine for the Northern Hemisphere, for us. It's not something abstract, something I'll put in my arm in a few months. And ironically, 2 of the strains come from the United States. And evidently they were shared before Trump came into office. Today it would be impossible. So the paradox, if this continues, we may end up having suboptimal vaccines that don't protect us, but don't protect also old people and children in the United States. This is so irrational. So that's why I say I think at some point there will have to be an emerging image of what the foreign policy and multilateral policy for the United States will be. And so I hope the damage is not irreversible, but for the next 4 years, we will know what they are facing. So coming with the silver lining, because as you said, and I know it's a platitude, but don't waste a good crisis. And so I've been in a few conversations. You have a number of countries that start thinking not just surrendering to the chaos, but where do we go from here in several respects? And I will mention 2. The first, money, obviously, which is one of the big shocks. WHO has more or less, if the situation continues, lost 20% of its budget. And clearly, as you said, as Jussi said, the dependence of the multilateral system on one state is unsustainable. But also the dependence on 20 states, because after all, the pool of donors is so limited. We are talking about 20 countries, philanthropies like Gates and so on. So there is clear an effort to start rethinking a system of international funding that is also not the best for global health security and for global public good. Because a system of development funding has big limits and is not, in my view, the most appropriate. So a more diffuse responsibility, everybody pays something, global public good, everybody should contribute. Non-traditional donors, Gulf countries, everybody's tapping them, and for them it's pocket money. Being serious about innovative financing, like neutral taxation, airline tax has been experimented already, it's nothing new. So I think there is an effort to start thinking concretely about this. The second, obviously, is so can we reform, can we consolidate, can we streamline a global health governance ecosystem, which is very much present in Geneva, which is not optimal in the sense it's crowded, it's a lot of transaction costs, a lot of different demands on the recipient countries, it's competitive, it's disorganized. And so these are difficult choices because states speak very loftily, but when it comes to dropping their own pet project, they immediately get cold feet. But with a crisis of this magnitude, they may have to walk the talk, as we say. And I don't know if there is anybody from UNAIDS in the room. I have many friends there. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news. But as the situation continues, UNAIDS has lost 50% of its budget. The US financed 50% of UNAIDS, both core costs of the Secretariat and programs. If this continues, just to use Elon Musk's expression, UNAIDS goes to the wood chipper. But so that's bad, but it may be the beginning of the consolidation of a situation of streamlining and consolidation where people have been saying for many years, do we need a big program on one disease? AIDS exceptionalism is over. So that may be the moment when states have to really bring it back to the existing organization and start thinking of what we actually need in a very different financial, geostrategic, and political environment. I think that kind of conversation has started already. They will take time, but that to me is a silver lining, so hopefully.
Thank you, Gianluca, for walking this through, and also thank you for highlighting the vulnerability with respect to information sharing. Because a lot of what good international cooperation is about sharing information. And trusted information, be that also on climate change with the World Meteorological Organization, on health, and on many, many other issues. So that's a huge vulnerability that also should be on the radar, how to ensure. Now, you heard two examples of the section on diplomacy in action. I'd just like to pinpoint one exceptional chapter by Tony Rino and also on colleagues on farmer-managed natural regeneration, which has been an exceptional approach to regenerate large swaths of territory bigger than Switzerland in many parts of Africa, and which has in fact been scaled by connecting this movement to the movement of the World Council of Churches here in Geneva, so that through the global communication chain of the World Council of Churches, you can in fact reach many more people, particularly through their religious affiliations in many parts of the world. Very worth reading also on this, how Geneva has essentially scaled and continues to scale one of the most effective natural regeneration approaches. Now, our next section is the radar. What's really on the radar? What are the examples of really critical issues that percolated out of the exchanges that we had during the year? And Jean-Marc, I'm very happy that you're with us. I can't see you right now, but I know you're there. You coined the phrase, a very poignant phrase, weapons of mass disinformation. And you wrote a very powerful article of how in fact disinformation is weaponized and what one could potentially do against it. Jean-Marc, please.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and also to contribute to this year's edition of the Geneva Policy Outlook. So this chapter is about one application of emerging tech that has concrete implication, and this is just one. I mean, there are several other emerging technologies, synthetic biologies, neurotechnology, that will be completely disruptive and change the way we interact and even what it means to be human, in the near future. So here, basically, what is interesting is that we're witnessing a perfect storm. There are two tendencies that are, in a way, meeting. On the one hand, we are witnessing the end of the Enlightenment era that was based on facts, science, and what is preached here at university, and what basically brought the West where we are now, which is human progress and technology. And this trend probably started beginning of this century, and finally, it was academics that were at the roots of that. Those who are, the French philosopher Derrida, Foucault. There is no truth, there is no facts. It's all social construction. So this is not a bottle of water. This is a bottle of water because we agree that it's a bottle of water, but we could call that a car or whatever. And so the power of this deconstruction methodology is that basically you have to go to the core of the argument, which is really good, but then you have also to reconstruct, and most of these philosophers did not reconstruct. And it was okay as long as it was among academics, but slowly it crept out of academia, and by 2016, when you have a president that is elected on fake news, and basically makes fake news, if you're on the new currency, then it completely challenges how you assess what is true and what is not true. And since 2016, and COVID didn't help. Basically, COVID crisis was the first instance where, they're talking about the vaccines, and what we're witnessing these days is very concerning, especially if you think about who is now heading the health department in the United States. So this is, if you want, the normative framework. But at the same time, technology has developed to create the means to actually manufacture this information at a scale that is unprecedented. And this has to do with development in artificial intelligence and generative AI, where basically anyone now, each of you, can be a disinformation machine. You remember 2016, we were talking about the troll farms in St. Petersburg. So it was this building filled with people that were trolling on Americans regarding the US election. The troll farms were owned by a guy called Prigozhin, who then suddenly died in a plane accident a few years ago after he marched on Moscow. And fast forward the last election last year in the US, you have in August 2023, Wired wrote an article that with $400, you can basically create your own press agency. You can become Reuters, AP, whichever. Right. Turns out that last year, during the presidential election in the US, a former sheriff from Florida who fled to Russia, John Duggan, basically started to create fake local news website. And this guy, with less than $400, created up to 160 websites that are generating fake information on 24 hours a day. This is where we are now. So you might have seen some deep fakes of Biden or some deep fakes of Trump. Remember last year that during the Republican primary, robocalls impersonating Biden's voice were basically calling Republicans not to vote. This is where we were last year. But this technology evolves at an exponential pace. All right. And so these days, the hot topic in AI is what we call agentic AI. So you might have used ChatGPT. So when you use ChatGPT or any other LLMs, you ask a question, and then you get an answer, and then you have a discussion with your chatbot. An autonomous agent, an agentic AI, is able to understand what you are looking for, understand the context, and go about with a strategy. So increasingly, what we're witnessing, and if you might have seen, on social media, I got a lot of videos these days on my social media profiles about, for instance, a polar bear swimming in the sea surrounded by sharks. The polar bear is saved by fishermen, and then they cuddle the polar bear. This is highly realistic, but it's totally fake. And so what you get now is machines increasingly that are generating fake content. And that is highly problematic because it directly clashes with what used to be what we're relying on, which was on legitimate sources. So for education, that becomes a major problem because you have to educate people, but also for research because increasingly you get synthetic data. And then obviously you get the issue of manipulation. Now you add to that increasingly immersive technology that get you stuck in a virtual environment, metaverses. Last year, Apple released Apple Vision Pro, which are goggles that make you live in a metaverse. And these goggles basically have eye trackers. So wherever you look at, the goggles can actually look at your eyes movement. Turns out that increasingly also now have earbuds that can basically monitor your brain activity, like EEG. When you start to correlate your brain activity with where you look at, you can start to correlate how an external stimuli impact your emotional state. And we are starting to develop this kind of data, neural data. Now, what does that mean? It means that increasingly, and it will go really, really fast, increasingly, we are already able to generate this information at scale, individual targeted disinformation, but increasingly, all our safeguards, we talk a lot about critical thinking that is being taught at university, will go by the wayside because your alarm bell will be completely neutralized. And this is a process that goes really, really fast. Just to give you an idea, the first time the technology behind deepfake is called GANs, Generative Adversarial Network. So you put two algorithms in a zero-sum game scenarios. One generator generates a fake picture, and the discriminator have to say it's a fake picture, it's a real one. It's a zero-sum game scenario. At any round, only one can win. 2014 was the first, it was invented scientifically. 2018, you get same quality as normal picture or true pictures. By 2023, in the war in Ukraine, the first deepfakes were used on the battlefield. This is how fast technology evolves, and that has a direct impact on governance because you need to create organizations that are able to go at the speed of this development and include the private sector because the private sector is in the driving seat. I just want to finish with one quote by Hannah Arendt in 1973. And she said, it was in a TV interview, she said, when everyone is always lying to you, the result isn't that you believe these lies, but that no one believes anything anymore. People who can no longer believe anything cannot form an opinion. They are deprived not only of the ability to act, but also the ability to think and to judge. And with such people, you can do whatever you work. Now, if you look back at what happens in the US, the most striking thing is not the foreign policy gesture of Donald Trump, but it's a lack of reaction of the American people. So think about what Hannah Arendt said 50 years ago.
That's a very worrying development, and also a very good reminder that there is more to worry on than just Trump, unfortunately. And I think what you also mentioned in your article, I just want to come back to this, that in fact developing a weapons control regime around something like this is something that could be could be something that comes from at least an approach developed in Geneva.
No, exactly. So what I didn't mention here is that behind that, in the West and in the military, we're based on the concept of coercion, using force to force your adversary to comply with your will. Now, what if you do not use force, but you can still make your adversary comply? And you do that with subversion. And so in the article, and in a previous paper that we published in 2023 at the JCSP, similar to what we did in the 50s and 60s with arms control agreement, we should start to think really seriously about developing maybe a regime of subversion control. Because the currency of democracy, if you want to destroy democracies, you do not target the military. You target the social contract between individuals and institutions, and this social contract rely on trust. And these tools, basically, what they do is they challenge this concept of trust, so by subversion. So we should be really looking at subversion, which is much more difficult to identify than coercion.
And this goes back to what Baya Canan said, what Peter Thiel said, no, that democracy is dead. We understand the instruments of attack against democracy. Now, this is one example of a kind of what's on the frontier that we gathered through the Geneva Policy Outlook. There are two other important issues which we put into the issue. One is an article by my colleague Aditya Bharadwaj on the relationship between microplastics and human fertility. Very important research results on very lasting impacts on human fertility. That is essentially another weapon of mass destruction in the making, and where Geneva, that primarily looks at microplastics from an environmental perspective right now, could also make the bridge to the public health community here in Geneva. And then we have another article by Irene Oyuk and Alan Chenner. Alan has also joined us here tonight on the quest for peace-positive land restoration in Africa, and a very critical look at carbon credit schemes, which are, in fact, in many instances, hitting communities that are unprepared to deal with them and are conflict-inducing. So a very important piece also to look at. Now, I'd like to turn to Pratit now. We've been working together on the Geneva Policy Outlook for a year now, and I wanted to explore your views and comments, because you have one thing that makes you distinct from all of us. You have more years ahead of you than us, and you will have to in fact live longer with our inactions than we have to do. What are your reflections?
Thank you so much, Akim, and thank you to all the panelists for those very insightful reflections. And as a young person, I must say that I had never imagined that the owner of a platform where we used to share memes and the littlest of the jokes will now head a government department and decide if so many other young people will get jobs or not. And perhaps I was reflecting on some of the things said in the panel as well, and as Jean-Marc reflected on, highly unrealistic but untrue, videos and clips around social media, and how it's so hard to distinguish. Just yesterday, I came across another one of them, which was President Zelensky and President Trump getting into a fistfight. Highly unrealistic, but highly realistic, but like untrue. So just for now, yes, just also reflecting on some of the things that was said about multilateralism, and as we move towards the discussion on multilateralism 2.0, there have been deep problems, as we heard from Professor Jussi Hanhimäki, and the big problem of them being that multilateralism is not inclusive, and exclusion of voices from multilateralism. I think that, having been a student in Geneva and looking at the strategic culture and ideas that emerge out of Geneva, I think the need for this community, or the strategic community of Geneva, is to look towards the global south as something where the impact of some of the solutions that are crafted in Geneva would be the most. Today, if we look from the center like Geneva, we see, countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, small island developing states, which are at the forefront of some of the problems faced in the world today, like climate change, are just a blop in the map. And I think if we change that, we take the first step towards reforming multilateralism automatically. And secondly, of course, there is a big need for trust, across the global north, across the global south. There's a huge need that whatever we build in Geneva towards a multilateralism 2.0 is full of trust, and that countries are able to trust each other again. And I think this is what we took for granted, and perhaps that is one of the reasons why we are here today, which is, that we took for granted that, the existing currents of multilateralism automatically build trust, and turns out it did not, and that led us to the world that we are in today. But also there is a sufficient source of hope that emerges, because as I hear so many of these hostile remarks from countries around the world, be it make America great again or make India great again, I'm always reminded of what St. Basil of Caesarea said, that when we live our own lives in isolation, what we have is unavailable, but what we lack is unprocurable. So as countries around the world, as leaders around the world, go about, become lone rangers today and isolate themselves against the world, making what they have as unavailable to the rest of the world, what they lack also becomes unprocurable to them. And economically, this might have consequences which might give us reasons to hope for a renewal of multilateralism. And when I came as a student to Geneva, one of the primary reasons was because, Geneva to me was more than, a city where there are different actors who are sitting together, different UN agencies coming together. It was more than just a whole where its parts are put together. It was something where, it was a hub of new ideas, of innovation, of bringing together experts from across sectors. And it was perhaps a living manifestation of what C.S. Lewis says, that two heads are better than one, not because either is infallible, but because they're unlikely to go wrong in the same direction. And, in Geneva, as these multiple heads come together, in the city where we craft solutions, we are unlikely to go wrong with something like multilateralism. And so it's best that we come together, we bring these heads together and think about these solutions. At the Geneva Policy Outlook, of course, I witnessed, and I got to be part of bringing forth these voices of experts and, who are so often behind the scenes, but it is so incredibly difficult to understand the nuances of what goes behind the scenes without these experts. To see the underlying complexity of these solutions is something that we can only do when we hear from these experts through platforms like the Geneva Policy Outlook. But as we also sit together to think about, this new innovation of Geneva, which is multilateralism 2.0, I'm constantly reminded that it's happening perhaps at a time where there are new executive orders, where, we don't know if we step out of the room and there'll be more funding cuts or there'll be something better. At the same time, we're planting this seed at a very tough time, and it constantly reminds me of what Michael Iglantieff says, that good ideas do not die because the times in which they were first articulated are too barren for them to sprout. They remain in the ground as seeds awaiting for the time to germinate. And I think Geneva is one hub which can wait for that idea to germinate in its own city. And at a time where the rest of the world is witnessing the damning indictment of multilateralism and, the state in which we see multilateralism today, I think Geneva can be the ground for this germination of multilateralism too, but it would require conditions. The first of these conditions would be that for this, of course, it's an innovation, and for any innovation to happen, there needs to be an entrepreneurship. In the case of multilateralism that we are developing in Geneva, there's a need for a norm entrepreneurship, and this norm entrepreneurship can come when young people are involved in dialogues. And because as having witnessed so many dialogues in Geneva and having witnessed the strategic thought of Geneva, I do sometimes feel that, if the door of these dialogues are open to young people, there is a capacity for our deeper strategic analysis. And honestly, I feel that, the young people who are in the city are ready, being at the center of these dialogues. They're ready for being involved in these dialogues. And secondly, I think as we look at these complex solutions like climate change, like health, like food insecurity, like nutrition, I think one another thing is needed, that we need to perhaps shift our focus in this new multilateralism that we are developing. We need to move our sort of center of analysis from people to places. We need to take the different contexts in question while we develop these solutions together. And at the same time, echoing within our hearts the hope that, that the contingent realities of our times are not the permanent features of the international landscapes. So while there is certain hopes, we need to keep moving in the direction of this building of this new innovation of multilateralism 2.0. And lastly, I think we've heard so many very key terms to solutions today. The idea of strategic opportunism and how it helps in building multilateralism. The idea of inclusive multilateralism, the chaos for design. I would add to that, another perhaps a hopeful idea to move forward to as we build multilateralism 2.0, which is the idea of cheerful pessimism. And it entails perhaps believing in getting things done, not in an easy way, perhaps, in a worse way possible, the worst case scenario being right around the corner, perhaps with the next executive order, fretting about the details, guarding against what can go wrong, not expecting perhaps things to go in the right way, but presuming that it is most likely to happen. And I think that cheerful pessimism can sort of guide us in this time of crisis as a city which is full of innovation. And I would end perhaps with my childhood favorite, J.R.R. Tolkien, and every time I think about anything else that comes up, I keep reminding of myself of this quote that, for behold, as said in Lord of the Rings, that behold, the storm comes, and now all friends should gather together, but each singly, lest all be destroyed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Pratit. Now, I've been a terrible timekeeper, and we already have 8 p.m., which is the time allotted to us. Now, what I propose is that for those who want to keep on talking afterwards, you just stay, and we talk a little bit longer. Are you ready to stay a little bit longer? I look for my panelists, just perhaps to offer some reflections. If you do have to go, I apologize. I have already one hand, very urgent hand up, and another hand. So let's take 10 minutes for some reflections, and I will pick one microphone. That microphone is coming. We start with you, and then we come to you. Yes, we start with you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, thank you for your insights. One comment and one question. The comment, I really second what Pratit said, about advocating for young people, because, this is like a very status quo city at instances, for young people. When it's not as easy to come here, when you have a lot of unpaid internships, and I think that's, it doesn't make it an easy or accessible territory. So I really like that you pointed that out about the youth. And my question is, it was mentioned, that Geneva is a diplomatic kitchen or a hotspot, Last year's Geneva Policy Outlook begged the question, how will Geneva remain relevant? And for me, that question is proper from a host, but especially from a host that tries to keep their guests within, inside. And for me, the fact that Geneva, for example, provided financial support for 10 million francs to NGOs, it's really a symptom, of a host trying to keep their guests in. So my question is, if we're talking about multilateralism 2.0, Geneva is not the only host, of the UN system. You also have another city like New York or Vienna, etc. Like, how could this really scale up, besides Geneva? Like, how could this really be the epicenter where this change happens if perhaps in these other host cities are not perhaps having the same kind of conversations? Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have another urgent question right here. Thank you so much.
Yes, my questions are always urgent. First of all, I would like to commend you. I think you increased the diversity of your panel from last year by about 300%.
Thank you so much.
Which I was yelling about last year. On your point of view of review, there will be no review of these foreign policy programs because they're busy hollowing out the civil service right now. They got rid of USAID staff. They're firing people at the CDC. They're firing people at the State Department. And this is similar to what happened in the 1930s. You get rid of the civil service staff, the people who know what's going on, then that's how you kill the government programs. And that's killing the programs also on the ground. But what has happened, in fact, is, for example, in Texas, there was a case of a child who died from measles. And this has terrified parents. So what happens is you're having these cutbacks in programs. People, and I'm talking as somebody who used to lobby for the government to other parts of the government. I lobbied from the State Department to the House of Representatives. Most people who run every 2 years don't know what foreign policy does. They had zero idea. So you have to break it down for them. You have to say your university is cooperating with another university. That makes jobs. But for example, this case of measles, parents are terrified. So now that forced Kennedy to shift. There won't be a review, but once people, and Geneva and other core university cities can help find the data where people are being affected, where programs are being affected, universities are being affected. And you can use this data to activate populations because there are coalitions that are very important. And one of them, for example, is PL 480. When you talk about AIDS and PEPFAR, that was a huge coalition that even happened during George Bush. So we need your help also from the US. We need you to invite scholars and students from the US to Geneva, whether it's remotely or others. And we have powerful university cities like Atlanta, where there are lots of historically black colleges and universities, like Washington, D.C., my own university, University of Michigan, which has a great football team. But I'm just saying that there is strategic opportunism, and you can help us with this data. For example, this business about the flu and the flu strains. People didn't know that they depended on the CDC as much as they do. So once you put this information out, it helps us fight back in the US and to fight the good fight so that we can resist and stop the people who are practicing anticipatory obedience. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There is a question here, and I see you both. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much, and I'm very grateful to all the panelists and to the moderator for what we learned tonight from you. Also following up on the intervention that was just before me, accidentally, I was wondering, we have heard a lot about the role of government in this crisis. The crisis of multilateralism sees from the point of view of governments and what government could do in respect of all the issues that were mentioned. My question is, can we say something about the role of civil society in this crisis? As far as the process of the reform of the UN Charter, in previous conference and talks about the subject, I heard someone express pessimism as to the fact that government would be ready to lead the process. And the idea was that, in fact, the process, if ever, would probably be a process initiated and developed by the forces of civil society. So I would be grateful to have a comment on that, and in general on a comment on what, in front of these multiple crises in multiple areas, could be done, thinking also of the role of communities, civil society at large, because we know that in some of the major crises we face, like the environment crisis, the role of civil society is growing, and it has a huge impact on what is happening or not happening. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have 3 more hands over there, and then I think we'll we'll bring it to those who want to reflect on some of the comments raised.
Thank you. I have 3 quick questions. First one, how come we have not seen this coming? I am reading now Project 2025, Peter Thiel's book. It's all been there. Why haven't we prepared? Number 2, I have a feeling that we're mainly speaking tonight about technical multilateralism. We spoke about WIPO, ITU is doing great, the Postal Union is doing great, so all the technical, even the arms control to an extent, it's a technical domain. What are the risks of going full in on technical and ignoring everything else, which is less technical, like human rights? And my third question is about education. One of my biggest disappointment in all this story is to see so many highly educated people like J.D. Vance, who benefited from some of the best education in the world, behaving unempathically, detached from the rest of the world. What kind of education do we need to provide to avoid this in the future? And I think, Akim, this is a question to you. How can we educate people who care about the rest of the world and not just about their own constituencies? Thank you.
I invite you to look at the syllabus of the Graduate Institute. That is my very short answer, of course. Yes, please. And then we have you, the sir in the back.
Thank you very much. I'm actually from the Hungarian embassy in Bern. I might be one who needs to be converted, but joke aside, I would touch upon a broader question about populism, and in connection to populism, of course, many of the established experts have written a lot about the problem of technocracy, which is also kind of a challenge towards democracy and indirectly multilateralism as a form of a democratic international community. And looking back the past couple of great crises, if we are honest of ourselves, the expert communities didn't get everything right when it comes to the financial crisis, then the Corona crisis, and we can name a few other. What would be your suggestion? What could be at this moment in time be a kind of a process of a more deeper self-reflection on the one hand for expert communities, for instance, such as here in Geneva, and what would be some kind of forms to kind of reconnect with populations who have detached themselves or who have great concerns whenever it comes to expertise, which is of course very much needed in all kinds of pressing international challenges. Thank you.
If you could just hand the microphone to your back, please. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have a problem. One of the speakers said, let's not waste a good crisis. I think that the best place to start in preventing this risk is maybe a revisit of what is the problem. What I've heard tonight relates to problems that supposedly were born recently in Washington, D.C. That may be part of a problem. But what about the problems that were ingrown in the multilateral system that have not been addressed for decades and are still not addressed? When half the world population has absolutely no contact and no recourse to the UN, and this has not been a problem. This has been a huge problem in the making. I don't see where the solutions address the ground problems. And I don't see that because I don't see a very good definition of what the problem is. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, can I, for very brief, sketchy responses, and then for those who have even more time, we can speak more bilaterally. You see if you want to...
I just wanted to address the one point, why didn't we see this coming, which is, it's an obvious question. I think the answer to that, because it's happened many times before. The United States has always been a difficult partner. in transatlantic relations. I show this week videos of George W. Bush giving one of his memorable addresses about you're with us or you're against us, etc., etc. They think he's a great statesman. Now, anybody who was around here in the early 2000s probably doesn't share that, but comparatively speaking, yes. But the point is that there was a big crisis back in the early 2000s, for example, and then he went away. And there was a crisis with Trump won. And it seemed to go away. America is back, Joe Biden promised and said, and it seemed everything was good. And then now we have this. So again, I think some among the scholarly community probably wondering, well, this is just another major crisis, right? And which will go away. I'm not quite sharing that opinion this week. Ask me after the first 100 days, and I may be sharing that more. But it is because the United States also, thankfully, is not a united country. Never has been, never will be. And of course, the United States changes course. It goes back and forth on so many different issues, including multilateralism, including its relations with the rest of the world. And that's why, there is, I think, this sort of cyclical thing that people figure out, well, we are now at the bottom of the cycle, but maybe it'll go back up again, as it has done so many times in the past. So I think there is that sort of expectations that the United States, Americans will see the angels of their better nature in the fullness of time. And perhaps, I hope, this is the case. But I think the point about multilateralism 2.0, that you can't really wait for that again and again and again and again. And I think that's where the real crisis in this context probably is.
Does anyone else wants to work quickly? You have?
I'm not sure. I would have a different hypothesis to answer that question, which is I don't think the progressive left ever took the right seriously. And so we dismissed these things as silly, stupid, ignorant, racist, and never really engaged. And I think that to answer the comment from our colleague from the Hungarian mission or embassy is what we need to do differently now. In this kind of fight, there was a piece by a former advisor to the British Prime Minister that talked about why the progressives were losing to the populists, and it was very much around this, that we are patronizing, we belittle them, and I think if we want to do things differently, it is about, A, explaining to the average person how global governance has an impact on their lives, and then B, taking their grievances seriously and engaging in how we frame global governance reform in such a way that it actually addresses those grievances. And I think, you were talking about global public goods. If we can frame, instead of talking about this in a very abstract way, as here's why a farmer in the US is going to benefit from investing in climate change, et cetera, et cetera. Very quickly on scaling up outside of Geneva, I think that's what we're trying to do with the charter reform idea, is that we, as Olivier would say, it's a young embryo. We let it develop while it's in Geneva, where it's a little less polarized and a little less cutthroat, and when it has matured to a certain level, we can then pass it on to New York, where it's a bit more of a difficult environment. And then on the role of civil society, absolutely agree. And that's exactly what we're doing. It is a civil society movement that is pushing member states, and I think we know that most big change comes from that kind of pressure. And often, when I'm in meetings with member states, those who want to see progressive change say, we need you, civil society, to put pressure on us. So what can civil society do? I think, one, elect better leaders. And so again, it comes back to this, how do we frame global governance in a way that makes it an election issue, makes how our leaders engage at the international level matter on the ballot, and then organize around these issues. And I think we've each, in the past, we've each had our issues. Some civil societies fighting on climate change, some are fighting on peace and security, et cetera. If we can unite and say, actually, we all deserve better governance than this, and I think the name of this coalition that I'm involved with, the Coalition for the UN We Need, you could go even further and say the Coalition for the UN we deserve, and we as citizens need to start demanding better governance at the international level, and then bringing all of these issue activists under one overall umbrella. So that would be, I think. Oh, and then finally, the question around, these problems predate this US chapter, absolutely. And I think, at least from our perspective, and certainly from the GPO's perspective, I assume, we've been thinking about these issues well before this latest drama. And so the UN Charter Reform Movement, for example, is very much trying to address the deep-rooted problems with the international architecture and, first and foremost, representation and inclusion of most of the world in the system. So I hope that there are many ways in which this current crisis is actually an opening for us to advance reforms that were long needed, and we talked about multilateralism and some of the problems and inefficiencies with multilateral agencies. That's another example where that predated, but this might offer us an opening to actually accelerate some of the reforms that many of us have been advocating for a long time.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to close.
Sorry.
If someone of your panelists is leaving, it's, I think, a good indication that you went over time. But allow me just a few words to say what's coming, what's ahead. We do realize in the Geneva Policy Outlook this is an exceptional moment, and we'll be organizing in the next couple of months a series of workshops that on the one hand aim to synthesize our work of 40 Chatham House meetings that we held since June 2022, and also to gather practical ideas that can help adapt and maintain the relevance of Geneva in an era of radical uncertainty, as we heard. We heard from you of some of the practical initiatives we are looking for as an example. We'll also spearhead three specific efforts. One is the update of the database on the financing of international organizations to the period of 2021 and 2023. We'll have another efforts of deepening our understanding on the mechanisms of building a network multilateralism between global hubs, particularly between Addis Ababa and Geneva. And the third effort is to accompany a student-led effort that reflects on the avenues for adapting Geneva and maintain its relevance as a global hub. So these are some of the issues that we, with the GPO community, will advance forward. We, of course, keep our radar up to design a new Geneva Policy Outlook 2026 based on a specific theme that we'll be identifying on the issues of negotiations and the usual radar. What are some of the issues that come out of this policy kitchen? So stay tuned. Follow us on LinkedIn. Follow us online. Allow me to thank particularly for the generous support to the Geneva Policy Outlook by the Republic and State of Geneva, the City of Geneva, and the Fondation pour Genève, and of course all of you to stay up until the very end. Thank you so much.